Anchor, Chapter 3. Blake hated her reflection. She hated how she looked in her swimsuit. She hated the bags under her eyes. She hated how limp her hair was. She hated everything, and Yang was going to arrive in 20 minutes. Adam still haunted the woman in her reflection. She could hear his voice, pointing out her flaws. Even now, she didn't own a two-piece bathing suit because of him. She could still hear him telling her, "Only sluts wear swimsuits like that. Are you a slut, Blake?" So, she wore a one-piece, and even that didn't feel like enough on the rare occasions she'd gone to the beach with him. She always had to keep her eyes down, never even dare to look at anyone else. Just the slightest glance at a stranger could stir that jealousy, that rage in him. More often than not, she'd wear jeans and a sweatshirt to the beach, even on a hot day. They didn't just cover bruises, but they protected her from the potential stares of beachgoers. They protected her. Though she covered her swimsuit with a t-shirt, there was only so much she could do about the rest of her appearance. Blake had managed to shower that morning without being prompted by her mother, but having clean hair didn't mean it would look good. It hung lank down her back, and there was little she could do to it to make it look date-worthy. She considered braiding it, but couldn't muster the energy. Loose would have to do. Since her visit to the shipyard the day before, Blake had been torn by panic, excitement, and regret. She was eager to see Yang for their date, but she had already begun to warp their meetings in her head. She'd been too much of a mess on both occasions. There was no way Yang would want to date her. That they were seeing each other at all was probably due to pity on Yang's part. Hell, she'd probably sounded so desperate for a date that Yang couldn't bring herself to say no. And despite this, Blake still ached to see her again. Her parents had noticed her jitters at dinner the night before. "Is everything okay?" Gira had asked. "Yeah." Blake had paused, unsure of what to tell them. She couldn't say it was a date. They probably wouldn't trust her judgment, and rightfully so. But she would have to tell them something. "I met some people today at the diner." "Oh?" Gira looked up sharply. "What kind of people?" Of course his mind had jumped straight to worry. "Just some of the locals," Blake had told him quickly. She hesitated. I'm going to hang out with them tomorrow." "Oh?" Callie's ears pricked up, giving away her excitement. "So you made some friends?" "Something like that, I think." For reassurance, Blake had reached into her pocket to touch the porcelain Yang had given to her on the day they'd met. It was quickly turning into a habit, but one that Blake couldn't bring herself to break. Callie had fired question after question at her about them. How did they meet? What did they do? What were their plans? To the last question, Blake hadn't known what to say. "You might want to wear a swimsuit," Yang had said, "and bring sneakers." Blake had no idea what that would mean. Both of her parents had been fascinated to hear about the visit to Crescent Rose. There hadn't been much to tell them, but they had still wrung every scrap of information out that they could get. "How did Ruby get into sailing?" Callie had asked. "It's basically the family business," Blake explained as she nibbled at her chicken. "Her dad owns the shipyard, so she started sailing when she was just a kid. I guess both she and Yang were counselors at sailing camp for a while, and—" "Yang?" God, it was weird to hear her dad say Yang's name. "That's Ruby's older sister. She doesn't race anymore, but she works on the shipyard. She's actually the one who's picking me up tomorrow." She'd been relieved that neither of her parents had noticed the blush that had started creeping into her cheeks. The knock at the door was 10 minutes early, and it jolted her from her reverie. Blake jumped off her perch on the couch, but it was Gira who answered. "Ah, you must be Yang. Please, come in." It was crazy to imagine how much more full, how much more alive this cottage was when Yang stepped inside. Everything that had seemed so dull and drab now seemed open and infused with color. Blake caught herself staring and forced herself to look away. Yang's red flannel was so bright, drawing her gaze like a moth to flame. She wouldn't be surprised if she got burned. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Belladonna, right?" Yang extended a hand to her father, the picture of politeness. She caught Blake's eye, then winked. Blake felt herself turn a whole new shade of red. "Gira, please. I don't want to be Mr. Anything on vacation." Blake rolled her eyes. "And I'm Callie," her mother bustled over, offering a warm hug that Yang didn't seem to expect but caught on to quickly enough. "It's so nice to meet you." "You too." Again, those lilac eyes caught Blake's over Callie's shoulder. "You ready?" "Yeah." "So, what are you guys doing?" Gira asked as Blake tried to slip out the door. Blake winced, but Yang didn't seem to mind the interruption. "It's a low tide, and I know a place that has a lot of tide pools." "Oh? Where is this, and what time are you getting back?" "Mom," Blake groaned. Callie wasn't good at playing it casual. "I'm not a kid." Again, Yang didn't seem to notice Blake's irritation or her mother's intrusiveness. Instead, she was peering curiously at the various I don't know what that word is. Instead, she was peering curiously at the various kitschy trinkets on the mantel. She picked up a small carving of a seagull and grinned. "This looks like something my uncle made," she told them, setting it back down. "He carves when he isn't working on boats." "Really?" Callie slid over to the mantel, looking at it with new eyes. He made it? It's so intricate. Dad keeps trying to get him to sell to some of the local gift shops, but he keeps saying he isn't going to be a sellout. Yang laughed at the word. But I bet I could hook you up if you wanted something of your own. I might have to take you up on that. It almost looks like a real seagull, doesn't it? Callie passed it to Gira. Her dad pretended to be interested, holding it up to look at the various angles. Sure does, he said politely. He wasn't into little knickknacks like this, but Blake appreciated the effort he was putting into keeping up appearances. Anyway, you ready to go, Blake? Throughout the conversation, Blake had noticed the glances Yang kept throwing her way. She tried not to read too deeply into them. Yeah, let's go. Should we wait up for dinner? Callie asked, relieving her husband by taking the small seagull away from him. Nah, I've got it covered, Yang said, waving her hand. It was nice to meet you. She ushered Blake into the warm afternoon. Leaving her sweatshirt behind had been the right move, she quickly learned. It was muggy, and already her t-shirt clung heavily to her skin. For a moment, they stood on the deck, and Yang faced her with her familiar bright smile. So, she said, putting her hands on her hips, daring Blake to speak. So, Blake echoed, her voice much softer and more timid. She paused, then said in a rush, I'm sorry about them. They can be a little protective. Yang shrugged. That wasn't bad, really. Weiss's dad was always 10 times worse than that, and your parents are nice about it. I guess. Blake folded her arms, suddenly nervous and struck with the impulse to look away, which she did. The silence was what drew her eyes back up. Yang's expression had softened. Hey, it's all right if you don't want to go. We can always... No! The quickness of her reply made her cringe, but she couldn't stop it from tumbling off her lips. Yang's eyebrows shot up. I do want to. I'm just... Again, she had to look away, unable to bring herself to say nervous or scared. It would hit too close to everything she wanted to avoid. Instead, her heart rattled in her chest, probably even loud enough for Yang to hear if she listened hard enough. Surprisingly, she didn't wince when Yang reached forward, plucking at a strand of hair. The roughened fingers caught on her hair, but didn't pull. Instead, they curled the hair around them with a sailor's deftness. Blake could hardly bring herself to breathe, let alone look back at Yang. It's okay to be nervous, Yang said. She was close enough for Blake to feel her breath as she spoke. She stopped moving her fingers, letting the hair slide out from between them, but didn't move her hand. It's a trap! Blake's mind screamed, but not even that fear stopped her from tilting her head, her cheek resting lightly against Yang's palm. The roughness was so different from the smoothness of her own skin. There was something comforting there. She closed her eyes at the rightness of it. I know someone's hurt you, Yang murmured, brushing her thumb on Blake's cheek. Yang's hands felt cooler as heat rose to Blake's face. I didn't... She began, but Blake's thumb drifted across her lips. It wasn't the same as when Adam would clamp a hand over her mouth. This was a gentle request, not a demand. You don't need to explain, Yang said, her voice level and reassuring. I just don't want to force you coming with me if you don't want to. I do, Blake spoke in hardly a whisper. It's okay. You're okay. At this, Yang laughed a little. I'm okay, she chuckled. I didn't mean okay, like that. Blake opened her eyes again, unsure if she'd inadvertently offended Yang. She didn't look offended. She was only focused on Blake. I mean, it's okay, sweetheart. The smile that broke across Yang's face was genuine. I think you're okay, too. This elicited a small laugh from Blake. Still smiling, Yang pulled her hand back from Blake's face, and she missed the touch before the fingertips even left her skin. I'm not going to hurt you, Yang said, smile fading and tone becoming more serious. I mean that. It was so easy for words to be just words, for promises to be broken, but Yang's were different. These words had the enormity of a tidal wave hidden beneath the ocean's calm surface. She tried to hold back her expectations, but she was already being swept away by Yang's promise. She could only nod. As it turned out, Yang didn't have a car. Blake had never been on a motorcycle before, but Yang helped her with the helmet. Is it going to be too much for your ribs? She asked, as she helped Blake situate herself behind her. This should be okay, as long as I don't fall off. Blake's face must have betrayed her nervousness, for Yang offered her a reassuring smile. I haven't lost a passenger yet. He won't be my first. Just grab hold of my waist. Don't worry, you won't squeeze too tightly. Not wanting to seem cowardly, she set her hands very formally on Yang's waist. It was difficult to try not to think about the muscles under her palms. They were hard, even under the cushion of Yang's flannel. She wouldn't think about that. She couldn't afford to. Yet as the bike picked up speed, Blake's restraint was tossed to the wind. Out of nervousness, she secured a tighter hold around Yang's waist. The place Yang took her to was off the island, at the tip of a sharp peninsula. Swaths of pink and purple flowers lined the road as they made their way to the very end, where the trees thinned out and gave way to tall grass. By the end of the ride, Blake was embarrassed by how closely she had slid to Yang. Their bodies were almost completely flush by the time she pulled into a small driveway. She was relieved that Yang made no remark about it as she helped Blake off the bike. "How was your first ride?" she asked instead, grinning. "It was different." "But you liked it?" "I think so." Yang took her helmet, and Blake was better able to check out her surroundings. It was another cottage, though it appeared vacant. She frowned. "We're not trespassing, are we?" "Here? Nah." Yang worked at the buttons of her flannel. "This is Maria's cottage. She's like some distant aunt of Ruby's, I think. She's super old, and she's off on a safari or some shit. But she's like our grandma. We're always welcome here." "As long as you're sure." She looked away as Yang stripped off her flannel. Underneath, she was already prepared for walking the shore, with the white bikini top she'd been wearing in that one Facebook picture. The anchor tattoo on her shoulder rippled with movement as she tossed her flannel over the seat of her bike. The whistle around her neck hung low, drawing more attention to her chest than was truly necessary. Blake somehow kept herself from gawking, but she didn't move to take her own shirt off. Adam's accusation still rang in her ear. Yang led her down a small sandy path through the grass. The path ended abruptly with a short descent down a few steps of rock. Yang helped her down, reaching up with her scarred arm to clasp Blake's hand in her own. This climb was different than the other day. It wasn't as steep as the rock she'd climbed down during the race, and she was a lot more comfortable with the concept of being helped. She could almost admit that she liked the way Yang held her hand. Once they were actually on the rocks, it was a fairly level walk. As they got closer to the mounds of seaweed and debris that marked the tide line, Blake saw the pockets of water in the rock. She knew what tide pools were, but she seldom explored them on Menagerie. The first one was shallow and lifeless. Yang peered into it, then shook her head. "The ones with the rocks and seaweed in them are our best bet," she explained, leading Blake further down toward the shore. "If there's any critters, they'll try to hide from the sun." "So we're hunting animals? Like what?" "Crabs, mostly. There's also starfish sometimes, and sea urchins, and lots of mussels. More periwinkles than you know what to do with." Yang knelt beside a deeper pool, going wrist deep to lift a slimy rock. "We find little lobsters once in a while." Blake knelt beside her, looking for any movement amid the cloudy silt. "Careful," Yang warned, replacing the rock. "Don't scrape your knees on the barnacles or shells." "I'll be careful." Blake reached forward for another rock. This time, Blake caught a flutter of movement, and Yang's hand slipped in faster than Blake could react. A look of concentration crossed over her face as she scanned the water. When she pulled her hand out, she was gripping a tiny green crab. "He's a cutie," Yang cooed to it. "Want to hold him?" "Will he pinch?" "Maybe, but he's little, so it won't hurt." Blake held her palm out, and Yang set the small creature there. Its little appendages wiggled against her, and she had to cover him up with her other hand to keep him from escaping. "It feels so weird." Blake made a hole between her thumb and forefinger, looking in at the beady eyes. "It's no different than holding a bug. Then again, I've been catching these guys my whole life." Yang sat back on her haunches, watching with a satisfied grin as Blake gently lowered him back into the water. "Isn't Menagerie an island? Have you ever done this before?" Blake frowned as she wiped her hands on her shirt. "Not exactly," she said slowly. She hesitated. "The guy that... my ex, actually. He wasn't really into that sort of thing." Yang's eyes glinted as the expression on her face hardened. "And I guess you never got much of a chance to do it by yourself?" Blake said nothing. Her eyes were scanning the water again. She squinted at a slight movement, then reached her hand in. The little creature she pulled up was tiny, but easy enough to catch. "I didn't know you had hermit crabs," she remarked, surprised. Compared to the hermit crabs that she sometimes saw at pet stores, this one was unimpressive. It ducked into its shell as Blake stared into the hole. "Oh, yeah, I see these little guys a lot." There was nothing in Yang's voice that betrayed anything other than mild curiosity at the little critter, but Blake had a feeling that the topic of Adam hadn't been forgotten. The shell this crab lived in was the size of Blake's fingertips, and with him hiding in it, Blake could barely see the little legs. "Ruby tried to keep one once as a pet, but she left it in the garage and forgot about it," Yang told her with a sad sigh. "Poor Jude." She shook her head woefully. Blake smiled as she replaced the little thing back into the tidal pool. This may not have been the bright, colorful life one might find in the tropical waters of Menagerie, but Maine's creatures had their own practical charm. Yang carefully steered them away from the seaweed-covered rocks. "They're slippery, and I don't want you breaking any more bones," toward the smoother, more predictable path along the rocks. A washed-up buoy was tucked, sun-bleached, into some rocks just beyond the tide line. Broken bits of crab shells were strewn about the rock, leftovers of the hungry birds that had dropped them there. Small crabs were the most plentiful creature they'd found, though Yang did find a starfish clinging to a grimy rock. She lay it on Blake's palm, where it barely stretched from one end to the other. It was rough, almost spiky, yet somehow graceful. "Ruby has a starfish tattoo, you know," Yang told her as she lay the starfish back into the pool they'd found it in. "It's her only tattoo, and she swears it'll be her last." "That's cute. I don't have any, but maybe I should." Truthfully, Blake had never considered the idea, but she liked the look of Yang's. It would also be one more way of severing herself from Adam, who'd always told Blake how bad they looked on women. If you need someone to hold your hand while you get one, let me know, Yang replied with a wink. Blake blushed. There was a small expanse of sandy shore that Yang led her to. Both kept their eyes peeled for sea glass or any other washed-up treasures. If the edges are sharp, it isn't really sea glass, Yang informed her, demonstrating with the dark brown shard they'd picked up. This is probably just from a broken beer bottle, not too far from here. Real sea glass is more worn down. I still have that porcelain, that you gave me the other day. Her confession came out more awkward than she would have liked, but Yang still smiled brightly. Really? Yeah. Blake reached into her pocket, pulling out the small fragment. I know. It's probably silly that I've still got it. Not at all. Yang stepped closer to her, taking it from Blake's hand. The smile she wore as she looked it over was a tender one. She handed it back to Blake. You can think of me whenever you look at it, yeah? I do. Her cheeks warmed at the admission, but she had no inclination to take the words back. It was the truth, after all, she told herself. There was no shame in that, not when Yang was looking at her like this. Embarrassed, she slipped the porcelain back into her pocket. Yang said nothing, only reached out to run a hand down Blake's arm in a way that gave her goosebumps. She turned to walk back down the shore, feeling Yang's eyes on her back. The tide was beginning to creep back in when they finally called it quits for the tide pools. The breeze off the ocean had a cooler hint to it than when they'd first arrived, and Blake began to regret not bringing a sweatshirt. Her shirt was damp from where she'd been wiping her hands all afternoon, and a shiver ran up her spine as she got back to the bike. Oh, here! Yang dug around in her saddlebag, coming up with a zip-up sweatshirt. I can't, she tried to protest, but Yang set it over her shoulders, her hand lingering on her back as she smoothed it. It's getting chilly, and being on the bike is going to make it worse, she told Blake firmly. With a sigh, Blake slid her arms in. It smelled so purely of Yang and of the shipyard that it could have made her high. And we're eating outside, so it'll come in handy then, too. Oh? So you do have a dinner plan? What sort of day would I be if I didn't? Yang asked with a grin. We'll grab some food from Leviathan, then eat on the pier. Leviathan. She'd almost forgotten the little convenience store, diner, movie rental place had a name at all. Why the pier if it's going to be cold? Blake asked, zipping up the sweatshirt. It was well worn, the lining no longer fleecy, but somehow even more comfortable because of that. On one breast, Maine Maritime Academy was written in nondescript letters. We won't have any privacy. If Ruby and John are working tonight, and if Ruby's let slip that I'm on a date, you'll be meeting the entire island. I'd rather just spend time with you. The way Yang spoke was so casual, but it set Blake's heart to pounding. For the ride back to the island, Blake was less nervous about holding on to Yang's waist. Spending time with her had eased a lot of the tension she'd been feeling, and though it hadn't completely alleviated, she was a lot more relaxed around Yang than she had been that morning. It was hard to hold up walls when the person in question was so good at seeing past them. Yang, what are you doing here? Weren't you... Ooh! Ruby bounced out of the kitchen, eyes darting back and forth from Yang to Blake. We're just picking up dinner, Yang laughed. Mind your own business. But Yang, she's wearing your sweatshirt! Blake blushed and crossed her arms, as if she could hide the name of the school. Yang shrugged. She got cold. Cold? Blake buried her face in her hands, and Yang surprised her by throwing an arm around her shoulders. Be nice! Not everyone expects Maine to start getting cold at night. Oh, is this the girl you were telling us about? The blonde cashier, Jean, joined them in the diner, looking interested. Have you told everyone? Yang accused her sister, who shrugged innocently. Define everyone. Well, definitely me, Ren, Nora, and Weiss, Jean said, ticking off his fingers. Probably Pyrrha, maybe Oscar. Christ, Ruby. Even Yang was starting to turn a little pink. You couldn't even wait a day? This is Ruby we're talking about, Jean clarified. All three of them looked at the younger girl, who shrugged. It's a small island, she said by way of explanation. Word gets around. They didn't stick around the diner long enough for anyone else to show up, much to Blake's relief. While they waited for Ruby to put together their sandwiches, Jean overshared about his own life on the island. Blake nodded politely as he went on about his sisters. Saf keeps saying I could move in with her in Argus, but city life might just be too much for me. Blake nodded blandly, even after he stopped talking. Yang snorted and rolled her eyes. You've been saying that for 2 years now. This isn't exactly news. But I might actually do it this year. I'll believe it when I see it. It still took longer to escape than either of them had thought. Ruby kept trying to wheedle details out of them, and Jean only egged her on. Apparently on an island the size of Patch, there was no such thing as privacy. Blake took advantage of the overlapping chatter to pay for their dinner, which Yang loudly protested as Jean handed her card back. Jean, I thought you were on my side, she complained as Blake signed her receipt. Then you should have been paying attention. Blake smiled slightly, shoving her receipt into her pocket. I'll get it next time, Yang promised, holding the door open for them. Blake watched her curiously as she stepped out. So there's going to be a next time? For once, Yang seemed at a loss of what to say. She opened and closed her mouth several times, letting the door slam shut behind her. Finally, she said, I mean, if you want to. I do, Blake admitted, blushing. Of course I do. Good. Yang gave a relieved sort of grin as she packed their sandwiches into her saddlebag. Then I'm buying next time. In the sweatshirt, Blake hardly noticed the chill in the evening air. Yang had rolled her sleeves back down, but otherwise gave no indication of the cold. My body temperature runs pretty high, she explained as she tried to cram an errant onion back onto the sandwich. Ruby likes to say I'm like a furnace, but I wouldn't say it's that hot. She does seem to have a way with the dramatics, Blake replied before taking a bite. The tuna salad had a little too much celery for her liking, but it was tolerable. Yang popped an olive off of her sandwich, flicking it into the air and catching it in her mouth. Tell me about it. God, when she and Nora start going at it, all you can do is duck and cover. A seagull soared over them, and Blake suddenly wished she was sitting beside Yang instead of across from her. It was stupid. She was being stupid, but she'd been pushing people away since even before she'd finally left Adam. When had been the last time she'd actually longed for closeness? She didn't speak until she finished eating. She was content enough to just listen to Yang talk about the island. Patch in the surrounding area was pretty much dominated by a handful of families. The Xiaolongs, the Roses, the Bronwyns, the Arcs. They owned most of the rental properties and businesses. Yang went into detail about the various small-town politics, sometimes forgetting about her own sandwich. Do you know who your parents rented their cottage from? Yang asked, balling up the paper bag their dinner had come in. Blake shook her head. I don't know. I haven't really been paying attention. Let me know if you find out. I bet I know the owners. I might even be related to them. We're related to practically everyone. That's one of the weird things about island life. I bet. Do you want me to show you around? The island, I mean. Yang sat up straight, eyes intent on Blake. When were you thinking? I work till 5 tomorrow. I don't think I can get away with another afternoon off this week, but... You took an afternoon off to be with me? Blake's eyebrows shot up, but Yang shook her head. Nah, I was gonna go climbing today, so I was already planning on the afternoon off. She winked. This is a lot more fun, though. Was it? Even though Blake couldn't imagine a better afternoon, it was strange to imagine that Yang had enjoyed herself as well. Yeah, climbing is good work, I guess, but I wouldn't call it fun. How does climbing work? Blake's question was rewarded with a dramatic gasp. Apparently, Ruby wasn't the only drama queen in the family. Come with me sometime and I'll show you. It involves lots of mud. Yang paused, grinning wickedly. Though we probably shouldn't get mud involved till at least the 3rd date. Blake was so surprised at the unexpected innuendo that she laughed out loud. She caught herself, still unused to the rusty sound that squeaked out of her throat. Yang leaned in, settling her chin in one hand and cocking her head to the side. I love your laugh, she said simply. They made sure to swap numbers when Yang returned her to the cottage. They'd go out again soon, Yang had assured her as she punched the digits into Blake's phone. As soon as Yang could figure out a good time. She'd give Blake a tour of the island, or take her clamming, or take her out on Amber Silica. Yang was already full of dozens of ideas for dates, and Blake was struggling to keep up. God, this is such a tiny cottage, Yang said, wrinkling her nose, stalling for time. Blake nodded. My parents, she began, then stopped. Would it be crossing a line to tell her this? She considered, then decided to continue anyway. There was nothing secretive about this. My parents booked this cottage ages ago. I wasn't living with them at the time, so they only needed a place with 1 bedroom. They didn't plan on bringing me, but they didn't want me to be. She stopped, trying to find a word that wouldn't garner sympathy. She sighed. They didn't want me to be alone for the summer. But, yeah, I'm sleeping on the couch. Shit, Yang said, making a face. For the summer? Yeah, Blake forced a weak smile. If you ever feel the need to sleep in a real bed, just send me a text, Yang replied, her tone too serious to suggest something like a hookup. We've got a big house, and we have an extra room, in case, the couch throws your back out or something. I'm young. I can handle it, Blake shrugged, mimicking the words Gira had used when they'd first proposed bringing her to Maine with them. Just know the offer's there. Somehow, they were standing at the steps of the cottage deck. Behind the trees, the sky was turning a dusty blue. Night had descended without Blake even consciously registering that it had. Well, the sun had been with her this whole time, she thought stupidly, staring at Yang. Thanks for coming with me today, Yang said after a moment, staring right back. In the coming darkness, it was harder to see what Yang's expression might have been saying. The smile, though, was enough. It was fun, Blake agreed. She was overcome with an urge, a more intense and crazed feeling that she could remember feeling in years, or ever, to throw her arms around Yang, to bury her face into her shoulder, to cling. She wouldn't be so foolish. I'll see you around, sweetheart, Yang smiled, then backed away, returning to the bike. Blake saw her turn to look over her shoulder once. With Blake's luck, Yang should have been struck into a pillar of salt right then, but just for tonight, there were no biblical disasters to destroy Blake's hopes. She didn't realize she was still wearing Yang's sweatshirt until she got into the cottage. Callie had already set up the couch for the night, already anticipating her daughter to go to sleep early. "What are you wearing, honey?" Callie asked as Blake brushed past her. Blake stared down at the sweatshirt, horror-struck. "Oh, shit! I borrowed it when it got cold." Callie gave her a measuring look, a trace of suspicion there. "From?" "God, Mom, just lay off, okay?" Blake begged, pushing her away into the bathroom. Accusations. Why was she always followed by accusations? The sweatshirt hung loosely around her reflection. She allowed herself to look at it for only a moment before pulling her phone out. "I still have your sweatshirt. Do you want to come back for it?" she texted to Yang. With Yang on her bike, she wasn't anticipating a reply as quickly as she got one. "Nah, you can hold on to it for now. Looks better on you anyway." A small smile quirking her lip, she immediately replied, "I hope you're not texting and driving." "I pulled over first. Don't even worry about it." There was a pause, then another text came in. "I was hoping you'd text me." Blake blew out a puff of air, then looked back at her reflection. This morning, her reflection had looked so nervous, so unsure. She saw none of that in her eyes now. The sweatshirt was armor against whatever negativity that might have tried to worm in. She pulled at the fabric as she hugged herself, wishing it was possible to sink even deeper into it. It was another cold night. At least, that was Blake's excuse, as she pulled the sweatshirt on over her pajamas. Being able to smell Yang on the sweatshirt as she drifted off to sleep was only a pleasant bonus. End of chapter.